and hand it over to John and to Jez. Over to you.
Thank you, Donald. Great to have that introduction to hear about the weather everywhere. You've got a missed career there, Donald, in weather forecasting, I reckon.
Thank you.
Great to join you all, and thanks very much for attending from around the world. I can see we've got 30 participants. In the great tradition of these webinars, we're very keen to continue the interactivity and to have you fire away with questions and thoughts in the chat. And it's just my great pleasure to introduce Jez, really, and some of the report findings that we've had in Learning Insights Phase 3. And really, in this webinar, we're focusing on this issue of the global learning race. And just to warm up the theme, if you like, we're all really familiar, aren't we, with the fact that businesses around the world continue to experience unprecedented change, particularly as a result of technology, whether that be business model, customer experience, access and route to market, employee experience, how we work, how we lead and how we manage, all have been significantly and continue to be significantly changed by technology. But crucially and very significantly, how we learn or train is altering quite fundamentally as a result of technology. And as the workforce becomes increasingly connected, and as our employees adapt to their new environments, employers and businesses need to respond. We need to create as strong an alignment as we can between the changing needs and expectations of the customer, of employees, and of the employer, to make it easier for businesses to collaborate across borders and for employees globally to feel confident that they're skilled for the future. So skilling for the future clearly is a critical theme for employers and employees, and crucially employers need to listen to their workers, their training needs, ensure they're continuing to focus on upskilling, or risk losing them, or risk losing their customers to other markets who are making skills and reskilling a priority. So what Jez will show you is some of the different statistics and the insights from those statistics about what's happening globally in terms of skills, employers and employees' attitudes to skills and reskilling globally, that give us room for thought, pause for thought about whether we're doing enough in our own markets and our own organisations. So before Jez starts, we thought it'd be useful just to have you think about a couple of questions and maybe drop some thoughts initially into the chat just to get us going and to keep this interactive as we go through the morning session. So first up, just how confident are you that your organisation, wherever you work, is prepared for the changing skills environment?
And John, I'm very interested to see people's response to this, because having seen the results of the research, I think we'll be able to balance what people are saying with at an anecdotal level, with the responses we'll have from the room, with some really, really interesting hard data from the substantial cohort of people you had answering your survey internationally. This business, how confident that your organisation is prepared for the changing skills environment? We have to just agree that the skills environment is changing, just as the business environment is changing. And the degree of preparation of organisations and whether people working for those organisations feel they're actually prepared for them, I think is pretty, well, I don't want to lead the witness or steal your thunder, but we know from the results that there is let's say, a patchy view of whether people are prepared or not. So Dom is saying we're a manufacturing organisation and we have no sense of the changing skills environment. Dom, can I just ask for some clarification there? Are you saying that there is no sense that the skills environment is changing, or that there is a changing skills environment, but you're not quite sure how you're going to respond to it? If you could just give us a bit of clarification on that would be great. By the way, I don't think you're alone if it's the latter. I think that there are plenty of people who feel that something is going on and don't feel quite ready for it. And by the way, I think reskilling is a huge issue at the moment, which not nearly enough people are talking about. I can see, by the way, and the speakers can all see that there is a line there saying multiple attendees are typing. So we're sort of waiting for those for those bits of typing to pop up. Without giving too much away, John, can you say what your views are about this, without giving too much away in terms of the research?
Yeah, I think without giving too much away, still Jez's thunder, we see great variety across the world in terms of employers' readiness, and what we tended to find is the developing economies investing more rapidly and having more commitment to skill development, and we've got an appetite. We see an appetite amongst employees that exceeds the appetite of their employers for skill development, investing in training.
Perhaps I don't want to steal your thunder. I'm not sure is it the appetite for employers, but perhaps the ability of employers to respond. Right. It may be that they want to, but they just don't know how to. Looking at the responses, this is why I love the Learning and Skills Group. We get this in-depth, rich, qualitative information of real experience. Gail is saying small organisations seem to be more able to adapt to the digital changing workplace, where our large partners seem to struggle with the digital shift. I think that's a really good summary of it. It's not necessarily the large partners don't want to, but they just don't know how to turn the ship. And James is saying, with the support of management, IT, and access to resources, I think my role as an IT trainer in local government makes the local council fairly well prepared. As a former Surrey boy myself and familiar with the oak leaf logo, James, I'm glad to hear that. And James says, Dave says, and I think this is interesting, more about, not so much about getting ready, but more about responding in an agile fashion, which kind of echoes Gail's point that, yeah, you can respond in an agile way if you're small enough. If you're large enough, it's more difficult. Kathy, love it. We know skills are changing, no evidence of being prepared for it. Very interesting. Dom gives a bit more clarification on his point. Rory adds, lots of changes in accounts, a step towards in response to market changes. Within accounts, Rory presumably means the accounts, the companies that use service. And Annalisa says, I'm not confident. Unfortunately, I've seen little, and I'm being generous there, of investment in any type of upskilling. You wouldn't build a manufacturing plant in the UK today, says Dom, quite baldly. And I think Annalisa says, look, that just goes to show it's unclear how to invest. People are training, Dom points out, but what exactly do you do about it? So look, I think a very good summary here, Jez and John. This is the situation we're in, but people aren't quite sure of, well, I think there's a constant theme here, which is, yeah, things are changing. Different sizes of organisations can respond differently. It's not necessarily large organisations don't want to, but they just find that they don't quite know how. I think that's a fair summary. I'm laughing at James's point there. So I'm going to pass it back to John now to carry on, because we're well into the presentation now, but thank you for all this input. Please keep the input coming. I think on the next question, it may be we have a lot of people from the UK. We don't need to spend too long on it, John, but do you want to just get it up?
Yeah, so for the next question, I think we've got a great international group this morning. Just to, Jez will come into this, so perhaps we won't debate this one now, but I think crucially, how confident are you that your country is getting ready for the changing skills environment? And we've seen some comments here already in the chat about, you wouldn't put a manufacturing plant in the UK, for example. The research that Jez is going to take you through will show that there's a variety of paces going on here, if you like, in different countries around the world. And, crucially, there's an obligation, if you like, I think, anyway, that governments and the economy collectively have to the skilling agenda. It's not necessarily down to a single organisation. So when you see an economy or a country investing in skills significantly, you can start to consider losing customers or employees to those markets and to those companies making those investments. So how ready are we in the UK? How ready is Germany, Finland, other countries represented on this webinar? So without further ado, over to Jez, who can start taking through some of that data to give us some food for thought and further debate.
Brilliant, thanks.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everybody. Afternoon and evening, as Don's already said. From a rather chilly and grey Crystal Palace on the outskirts of London, so got to get my weather bit in there as well. Thank you for joining. So in the next half an hour or so, I'm just going to walk us through some of the key findings of this piece of research that we've done. As you see, we've gone to quite a large group of people. We spoke to over 6,500 employees, 1,300 employers, from 13 different countries. So it's a fairly large subject group, and I think what we've got is a good view. As John has already said, there's a great variety in the responses, as you'd probably expect. In terms of what do we take from that, I'd be really interested to hear your perspectives as we go through some of these statistics, just to see how they resonate with you, and to see how based on these views, what your experiences are. We've looked at a couple of key metrics within it. We've looked at the intention to invest as a key one, and looking at which areas in particular are seeking to invest in more in learning and development. And in particular, we've been looking at the alignment between the employer and the employee around their perceptions of learning. And going back to the questions is readiness, and how ready do employees feel about the future, and being ready for the future in terms of their skills and their abilities to respond. Equally, how well aligned do they feel with their organisations and the direction of travel that they're taking? So we tried to look at both perspectives, and then we tried to do some analysis between those perspectives to understand where there's alignment and where there's gaps, and hopefully that gives us some insight into what it really is an interesting conversation about the future of learning. So what we're going to cover this morning, say in the next half an hour or so, is just a quick look through the actual findings themselves, and the situation that we're in. So what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, what are the barriers that we're facing? Looking at the whole issue of alignment, and looking at initially some of the gaps that exist, and looking at some of the statistics that may raise some questions for us. It might not give us the answers. I'm not going to promise by the end of this that we've got all the answers to this. But I think what it does do is it starts to raise some questions for us as a learning and development community to think about our practice, what we're doing, how we're doing it, with whom, where and when, and how do we align together in terms of our from a macro perspective as a business or as an economy, but also with the micro perspective of learners and learners' needs. So, as I say, the data gives us some interesting insight into that. We've got a case study from one of the clients, which is looking at Dermalogica and their response as a global business. What is their response to this, and what sort of tactics have they put in place to try and mitigate some of the risks that are associated with this issue of alignment and this issue of globalization, and also the issue of shifting needs within the workplace. And apologies for those that are non-UK, but there is a reflection on this from a UK perspective, which I think is quite interesting. It certainly is from my perspective, and hopefully it will be from yours as well. So, as I say, I shall rattle through as much as I can. Please feel free to continue chat. If there's any questions that pop up as we're talking, please put them in there. I know Don's going to be doing some facilitation along the way. We may well pause if there's anything comes up. Don, feel free to dive in with any observations or conclusions yourself.
I will feel myself ready and agile to dive and interrupt as much as I think is necessary. Thank you.
Perfect. Great. Okay, so sorry, I'm going to apologise for this statistic just to start us off. It's a bit gloomy, I have to say. And this is an overall perspective from employees that they believe 79% of employees believe that we need to give greater focus to learning and development. And just 16% globally believe that they received enough, last year was enough, or it was effective. So I do think that this is it's an underpinning statistic which sort of does govern a little bit the sense of the work that organisations need to do to rethink and to maybe to reposition learning and development going forward. I think although there's some real positive indicators in the research, and there's certainly some sense that we at certain pockets of practice are really good, and there's certain levels of investment which are really high. This is an underpinning statistic that really should give us all make us pause a little bit and think about what we're doing and how we're doing it. both at an organisational level and at a practice and performance level. So sorry to start off with such a gloomy stat, but I do think it's quite an important one for us to hold on to. So we're going to look at some of the barriers as organisations, as employers see them, and some of the barriers as employees see them, just to get a sense of how the world is, and how different regions and different countries are seeing things. So looking at the employers, so funds and budget, and I think it's what was probably what struck me about this was that the range of this, for example, is that the 17% of Australia comes out as the most likely to say that they don't have access to enough funds and budget, and they're the highest. The lowest is 1%, and that's India. So India are the ones that feel that they've got the most funds and budget, and that's a statistic that will follow through. We'll see that happening more and more. And again, I don't know if I'm surprised or not at that, but I do think that in terms of the world perspective, there's certain emerging economies which are clearly investing more in learning and development than more established economies. And I think this sort of just gives us that sense that those more established economies really believe that from a learning point of view, they're not investing enough as they should. UK, by the way, is joint 12th out of the 13 countries that we surveyed. In terms of people, again, it seems that those more established economies don't believe that they have access to enough of the right people to deliver what's required, with 17% and 16% in US and Australia. India comes out at 5%, so they do believe that they have access to the right resources. So although these figures aren't massively high, we're not looking, 17 is the highest in terms of that. It does give an indication that, again, that those countries which are more established, again, aren't necessarily have access to the right people that they need to do the job. A lack of strategy. So this is how well businesses and organisations feel they're aligned to the future, and in terms of the learning requirements and needs. So how well does their learning organisation feel that it fits in with the future strategy and direction of their business, and how well does learning and development and employers feel that the skills is focused on the direction of travel. And in terms of the UK, it comes out as the lowest in that range. The UAE feels that there's only 2% of those feel that they need more access to that strategy. India comes out around 5%. So, interestingly, is there a disconnect between how the skills of an organisation and the skills of the workforce are being aligned with the direction of travel of that business? Is that a matter of organisational communication? Is that a matter of the perspective and the view of learning and development, or is it something around skills themselves and how much we value or don't value skills within those communities and within those organisations?
We've got a question from Christine Locker saying, could you say more about, you just used the phrase access to strategy, and it's on the slide as well. What does that mean? Who sets the strategy? Is this the organisational strategy? And did you know anything more about that in terms of where this strategy is supposed to come from? Presumably we're talking not about learning strategy, but about the organisational strategy set by the executives, the board of the organisation?
Yeah, my understanding of the question and how the context question was set was about the direction of travel that the organisation is taking, and then how does that apply to the needs, the emerging needs, skill needs of the organisation, and how those two things are aligned. So is there an understanding of where what that strategy is and the direction of travel that organisation's taking, and how well aligned is that to the emerging skills requirements of that business. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me, and I'm sure Christine will let us know if that's not making sense to her. Please carry on.
Okay. So when we start to shift that, again, the top three, I mean, we can dig into we could dig into lots of these, and as you can imagine, there's lots of different angles and perspectives that we can take on all this. That's what I'm trying to pick out, some of the key high level ones that are probably most interesting to us. In terms of employees. I suppose in some ways I've been around this a long time and seen quite a lot of this stuff before, but I think it is interesting when you start to look at those organisations, those parts of the world where it is changing, or it's not. There's a sense that we could be doing a lot more in terms of learning and development to support individuals and what that actually looks like. So in terms of the not enough time to attend training, it clearly in the certain southern hemisphere countries, we're looking at 29, 28, 28% believe that they don't get enough time to attend training activities. The UK, for example, comes out at 24. Sweden is the ones that believe that they at 18 believe that they have the most time, or feel that only 18% of them feel that they don't have enough time, so they're the lowest. In some ways, is this a reflection of the changing learning patterns of learning, and are we moving away from classroom-based training to much more learning in the flow of work, learning on the job, and is that a reflection of the fact that maybe these numbers are relatively low? I mean, I think 29% of people saying that they don't have it is a relatively low number, especially if you think about a range between 29 and 18, which is the highest to lowest. We've only got an 11-point range. So I do think that it's sort of indicative, maybe, of the changing nature of learning. So I think that that is an interesting context and something for us to think about and go forward on. I'll just picking up a question from Christine again. Do we know more about the expectation growth? I can't say I can answer that, Christine, off the top of my head. I might have to have a think about that one. If other people have got a view on it, I'd be more than happy to
tell you what, because other people are talking about it as well, I'm going to save the question. We'll save it to the end, and we'll have a discussion about it. How about that?
That's perfect, Don. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on. I'm mindful that time is ticking. So not enough resources. So in terms of which parts of the world feel that they do not have enough resources, investment funding and budget. So more commonly, it's these Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, Kenya feel that they aren't well enough resourced. There's not enough investment in it and funding the budget to deliver learning. The UK comes out 12th, so it's only it feels that it's high enough. Let's get sure I got the stats the right way around. Yes, I have. So those that are high believe there's not enough. Those that are low believe there is enough. With the USA coming out as top, believing they have enough resources, investment and budget, and the UK believing that there is enough. So from a learning point of view, from an employee's point of view, they believe that there's enough there. Interestingly, again, difficulty in securing time off the job. We find that there is the Argentina has come back with 30 in terms of not enough time off the job. UAE, India and Malaysia also feel that there's not enough time off the job. Again, is this a shifting nature of learning? Do we see different parts of the globe where maybe learning is in a different phase? We're starting to see different changes in behaviours and different sets of expectations. We don't really know that from the statistics, But again, it's a question in my mind: is that are those more countries, in the more which are responding to the shifts and changes and trends in learning, require less time off the job, and is that reflected in the types of learning approaches that organisations and individuals would be taking in the next few years? And that's a statistic we will come on to a little bit later on. So probably a really interesting fact and point that came out of the research was the amount of spend that organisations are putting into it at L&D in the next 12 months. I think probably going to Christine's point is that what's the benchmark? And it's very difficult to know what the benchmark is, and we didn't ask that question. But I think it's interesting that the indication of those countries which are planning on spending more, regardless of what the benchline is, India comes out as the top at 92%, so they're increasing. 92% of organisations are going to increase their spend, whereas in the UK, 54% are planning an increase in their spend, which puts the UK and Sweden in the bottom two places. Interesting in some ways. Does it reflect our position and where we're headed? Does it reflect the risks that are associated with underspending on learning? And as John said, in an ever-increasing global workforce, what impact does that have for us all? So we get to a point of looking at the perceptions in terms of some of the gaps around, and this is much more about the how an organisation feels. Is it ready for the future in terms of the skills that it has? It's not necessarily. It's more of a reskilling agenda versus a recruiting agenda. So what we're thinking about here is looking at those organisations that may feel they have the right people, but do they have the right? Are those people have the right skills? So 81% believe that the staff that they need, they have the right people for it in the next 3 to 5 years. There is a however to this, but employees don't feel. 71% don't feel that they have the skills to do the job that they need in the next 3 to 5 years. So clearly there is a fairly large gap and disconnect between how employers perceive the future and the skills that they have, and how employees perceive the future and the skills that they have. And therefore, what do organisations, what do learning and development need to do to close that gap, to create that increased alignment between what the employers are perceiving and what the employees are perceiving. An overlay of that, and a question that we asked, was about keeping pace with change. 33% of employees do not agree that their employers themselves are keeping pace with changing skills. So are they getting left behind in the race of digital transformation? Are they able to make sure that people's skill sets are fit for the future if their organisational structures, systems, processes are not aligned to a rapidly changing digital world that we're living in? So again, going back to for me, this is one of those key disconnect points, gap points, that means that we can, we should be asking some questions about what is it the skills are required for the future. What sorts of skills do our employees need? Are we aware of them enough, and are we able to respond to that changing need? Clearly, if we're in a reactive perspective, then there's a chance we'll never catch up, and then will organisations and individuals just fail to be competitive and fail to be able to deliver what performance is required. So how confident do employees feel about that they have the skill sets and employability for the future? So this is, looking at asking those employees directly, do they feel that they have what they need for the future environment? USA, Kenya, India come out in the top. 52% India being the top. So 52% of Indian employees feel that they have the future skills and that's required for future employability. Whereas in the UK, 27%, in France, 26% respectively, believe that they don't. So again, another fairly major gap in terms of the market position, and again, some aspects of maybe it's about the changing needs of the economies that we're working in, or maybe it's about just a different cultural perspective. I don't know. But for us, in terms of the UK perspective and maybe a European view, is that we need to be doing more to help and support our employees feel capable for the future. What's driving the needs for change in these different marketplaces? So this is another question that we ask. What are the market forces that are supporting and taking people forward in terms of what is it that they believe that they're responding to? And I know there's lots of other research. I know Donald's done some research on this as well, in terms of what are those market forces and how do those market forces play out in terms of learning strategy. US, it's much more, in some ways it's quite outward facing, so it's about increased competition and customer behaviours. So it's how do they shift and respond to the needs of their business, the marketplace that they're operating in. UK tends to be quite, I perceive this as quite inward facing, so it's about the changes that are happening to organisations, the digital transformation, broader economic pressures, how are businesses internally responding to that. India, a greater focused on technology and the fact that they're getting ready for a greater automated world with greater use of AI. Malaysia, intergenerational workforces, and UAE, climate changes. So some interesting perspectives.
Just to come in there, Jez, on your point about the stuff I know, I mean, digital transformation, when at the LPI, the Learning Performance Institute, when we run our annual conference in September, we ask about 500 to 700, depends, learning leaders, people who are responsible for learning in their organizations, to what their top issues are. And digital transformation, whatever that might mean, has been number one or number two for the past 3 years. So that absolutely chimes with what I've experienced in research at the LPI. And this business about automation and AI in India being so high is interesting, because when I run my annual global sentiment survey, it's noticeable that in some areas of the world, like in the US, personalization is an absolutely huge topic. But it's not big in India. In India, it may be the third topic. In the US, or rather in North America, it's absolutely number one. In India, what tends to happen is we tend to have automation, yes, but actually learning analytics and artificial intelligence are definitely seen as being a much more important topic for them. And my own personal experience in Malaysia absolutely backs up this obsession with intergenerational workforces. It's something they're very concerned about, possibly because they have a very tech-savvy younger generation, and it's a very large younger generation because of the demographic spread of the population. So it's always interesting that when you see what you found elsewhere, that's 3 different groups of experience and research. And there's research by Elementrix, by the way, in Malaysia, that totally backs it up. That research being corroborated here. So it's not just hearing it here, folks. I think this is pretty solid stuff because it reflects trends we're seeing elsewhere. Back to you, Jez.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. Okay, so what does this tell us really? So, fairly high level what it tells us. Employees around the world are recognising that they need to be upskilling for the future. And that in some instances those employees feel that their organisations aren't keeping track and keeping pace with future change. Employees, have identified the market forces that are driving them. What is their response to that? We don't know. And how well are those responses? How well do the responses in terms of those market changes fit and with the understanding and the perception of their employees? Are they aligned or they are not aligned? We know that only 2/3 of the global workforce are confident that their employers are keeping pace with these changes. So in some ways, it's this sense that there is a sense of dissatisfaction with employees to employers around the future of their organisations and the skill sets that are required to deliver that. And that, I think we saw it in response to the initial question. And no, it was clearly a UK-centric response, but it may be a global response that we as individuals see the rate of change as a real and everyday part of our lives, and everybody does that. But organisationally, we are being slow to respond to that change. And what does that mean going forward? And how do we accelerate that to ensure that people feel comfortable and confident with the skills and employability that they have? So for us, this is sort of like the sense of the importance of alignment, and making sure that what's driving organisations and driving organisation strategy and direction is aligned to their employees, and their employees understand that. Because one of an interesting statistic that came out. This is just there's a HR perspective. One of the respondents, which I thought was quite interesting before I move on to some more stats, was just looking at the changing nature of learning, and from a HR point of view, it's very much shifting away from a being collateral approach to learning to much more connected to the workforce and what the workforce requirements are. So in some ways, it's about shifting the nature of learning away from just being course curriculum based to something which is much more agile and flexible in how we support learners. One, in agility and flexibility in terms of the emerging needs, but also in terms of delivery methodologies and approaches which reflect a digitally enabled workforce and a digitally enabled workplace. So it is this shift that's happening, driven a lot by technology, which is driving certain attitudes around how we learn and our shifting and changing learning place. So a slight aside, but I think it's quite an interesting. It's a perspective that we probably should be mindful of. So the factors driving change from aligned. So what we found is when the organisational factors that are driving the change within for businesses and for employers are aligned with how their employees see it. So we asked the same question. So we asked the question, what are the main factors driving change? And when employers and employees agreed on a majority of factors, what we found was there was a correlation between satisfaction of their skills being up to date. So when employers and employees felt that they were aligned in terms of their direction of travel and the things that were driving them, employees felt that their skills were up to date. Equally, there was some correlation, less correlation towards the bottom end, but there was some correlation around when not aligned. So, for example, with France, when they came out as the country with the lowest satisfaction of skills being up to date, there was a low level of alignment between what was driving change between employers and employees. So for us, it indicated this issue that if employers and employees see the same needs and drivers for change and appreciate what that means for them in terms of their practices and behaviours, and are therefore supporting learning to reflect those needs and behaviours, then there is a greater sense that the skill sets are relevant, up to date, and are moving in the right direction. When there's a lower level of alignment, that satisfaction drops. Again, statistics quite high, but there is a distinction between the top and the bottom. So we could then ask some questions around learning solutions themselves, and it's sort of, for me, these raise some questions as practitioners that we need to be thinking about in the future. What are the tactics that other people are using? What's up and what's down? Again, those people that are plugged into our role in terms of learning technologies are well familiar with the trends and looking at what's in and what's up and what's down. I think for this, it's about how are we using them, and there's this question of what does it really mean to be a blend, and are we looking at one thing over another? Are we looking for a single solution answer to training, or actually are we starting to think there's certain trends in how people are learning, how they're choosing to learn, and does our strategy start to reflect how people's changing attitudes towards learning and knowledge needs to be, our support of that needs to change with it. So what does delivery look like in the modern workplace? So apologies for this next slide. There's a lot on it. So I'm just warning you that when I put it up, there's a lot of numbers, and I'll do my best in a couple of minutes just to try and highlight some of the key things. There you go. I promise that there's a lot of numbers in it. So what I've tried to do here is I'll highlight some of those key numbers for me. I think one of the key ones that comes out is this shift around on the job, and the UK, South Africa, globally 33%, but I think in the UK and South Africa, it's this sense that we are moving towards more on the job training, less about structured training and much more about people learning in the flow of work, in their place of work when they need it, which sort of indicates that shift away from maybe the need to deliver more off-the-job type training. Interestingly, from the UK perspective, peer coaching is quite low. It's not the lowest, but it's certainly bottom end of the mid percentile point. The lowest points around there are Sweden and Kenya. I think those are the red scores. E-learning is again sorts of emerging in UAE and in Kenya. So some of the more certainly in Kenya, would be an emerging market. For me, one of the key things here is around personalisation and the top technology around personalisation that obviously and the UK have come back at 25, which is again is sort of a midpoint. It's much in line with what the overall global perspective on personalisation is. The use of AI, again, the UK sort of coming out midpoint again. India sees AI as being a big driver. They're moving much more towards a higher use of AI, as we've already talked about. So there is some shifts in terms of the approach. I don't think there's anything necessarily that stands out as, well, this is, we can see a big shift in terms of certain regions or certain types of training being more popular. But there are some standout things, especially in terms of the UK. One for me, which I'm particularly interested in, is collaborative and social, and the UK seeing a drop in that. Be interesting to dig a little bit into that. Equally, gamification, USA and the UK, both drops 11%. That puts them in the bottom quartile of the survey, which means that are we moving beyond some of the fad aspects of e-learning, which as my language, apologies for other people, but are we moving away from some of this which are seen as being like the great silver bullet, to being a little bit more savvy around how we use technology to support our learning in the workplace. So very quickly, I'm mindful that we're getting towards the back end of our time now. So I just want to very quickly share this case study with you and some of the highlights from it. So Dermalogica are a global brand. We had they were one of the organisations that we spoke to. And gave us some insight into what they were doing. We asked them the same questions and what actually were they doing to try and create this sense of alignment, this sense that all the organisation and the employees were working together in terms of their direction of travel. I think the key message for them was they tried to keep things simple. They base it around some well understood global standards, and that's what they base their training on. So it wasn't overly complicated. There wasn't so much of it that either local businesses or local employees didn't understand us or didn't see the relevance of it. It was very much focused on delivering some very core aspects of what their business needs to do as based by a global standard. They're using those standards to develop the content and the assets, but reflecting that there is local difference. So there's a sense of actually global taking ownership and responsibility, clearly communicating that, but then supporting at a local level people making the changes that are required to respond to either local legislative or practice requirements or cultural requirements. And they did that through a task force, so they actually had a formal structure by which that central curriculum could be amended and changed, either taking feedback from local areas. So, these are the trends, these are the things that are happening, these are the needs of people on the ground, and then how do we shift that and how do we change that? And is that something that's global, or is it a local issue that we should be supporting? So there's a lot there about communication, a lot there about involvement at local level, but maintaining an overall global perspective on it. Some of the key priorities for them to make sure that they kept this difference between making sure it's relevant and stays appropriate for a local level, but also maintain the quality and the standard and what they need to deliver at a global level, was to ensure that local timing and local levels of urgency based on the market was respected, that local geographies were understood in terms of where people are, how they travel, the types of learning that you would approaches that you would then take to reflect those geographies. Facilities, how well connected are individuals? Are you in parts of the world where maybe internet connectivity isn't as good as others, or in terms of actual physical resources themselves around the actual kit that people are using to connect on? And equally, cultural behavioural norms, the difference between the US market and the UK market, and how employees respond to training is different, and therefore, adapting practice to reflect that, but recognising that the content remains constant within it. From a learner perspective, what do they value? They valued a clear pathway, clear understanding that it fitted with the business and where the business was headed. So it was relevant in terms of the longer term goals, but also in terms of day-to-day work and what they were required to do. So there was a sense that what they were doing fitted with an organisational blueprint, if you like. There was this whole sense of enablement and empowerment at a local level, but felt that people were being well supported at a global level, and opportunities to develop personally within that framework, and being valued by the organisation. So as an employer level, there's this sense that because I feel that my training has been well supported and well directed, I as an individual feel that value and engaged in that. So it's a good example of when effectively communicated and developed and aligned training works, and is real and relevant to individuals. So very, very quickly, just to close, I am mindful of time, some key highlights. That's, again, apologies for a UK perspective. Emerging economies overtaking UK in skills development, 50% to 4% of employers, and that goes against the statistic of India, 92, I think it was. So, UK's got some work to do. 71% of employers recognise that skills are needed to change, but only 66% of employers in the UK believe that we're keeping pace with it. That may be higher than some people on this chat may well think it is. I'm not sure. It'd be interesting to get a perspective. 90% of Indian employers predicted net increase in learning, again, versus the 54% from the UK. So that we've already talked about. And 13% would rate L&D in the UK as effective, compared to 31% in India. So again, quite a stark difference in the sorts of support that we believe that we're giving our people, and the sorts of responses we're getting from that. 25%, 42% recognise the impact of digital transformation in the UK, 65% and 62% in India. So UK probably mid, 25% in the US is quite low, but again very high in those more emerging markets, which are more aligned to the sense of digital transformation. So I'll close at that and offer time just a few minutes for any questions, and we've got 8 minutes left. If you're interested in the report itself, the high-level summary report, that's where it can be found. We are in the process of producing some best practice guidance on this report, which I believe will be published online at some point in the future, probably in the new year. I'm not part of the team that's doing that, but if you keep an eye on the Kineo website, I'm sure it will appear. So, Donald, I'll pass back to you.
Jez, thank you very much. Great job. Plenty of interesting information there and insight. A lot of reaction in the chat, as you would have seen as we went through. Christine Locher gives us a reaction in German. Mit der Schule ist es wie mit der Medizin. Sie muss bitte schmecken, sonst nützt sie nichts. Ich glaube, which means, look, school has to be like medicine. It's got to taste bitter, or it won't work. Yeah, that's not, I think, an accurate view of learning, but it reflects some of the cultural reaction that we got from particularly Christine and Gail and and Lisa talking about how different parts of Europe might react to, or how their views of learning might be different. We'll come to that in a second, but one really interesting point raised by James and then reflected on by Annalisa and Dom and Christine was, is there a shift towards a more US style of, by the way, if you've dialed in and you're not speaking, if you could put your phone on mute, that'd be great, because we might pick up some background noise otherwise. So if you're just dialing in to get the sound for the webinar, please put your phone on mute. That'll prevent background noise. So James raised the issue, is are we moving towards a self-funded model in education? That tends to happen in the US. People drive their own learning education. In the UK, it's less like that. In France, I think Gail would probably say it's much more that people expect the training and the learning to be delivered to them, if we can talk about it like that, but they expect the opportunity to be made real for them by somebody else. Do you have a take on that, Jez, as to whether the economic reality of employment being shorter and more contract-based is driving us towards a different relationship between people and employers in terms of learning?
I think it's an interesting one. We did ask the question. So we did ask the question, how many people, we asked of employees, how many pay for their own learning, education and training. This is not a stat that I put into the deck. The highest was 63% in Kenya, 58% in India, which again is interesting, since India is investing the most. So maybe they're reflecting the changes that actually, as employers, we need to put more into this because our employees are taking ownership and control themselves. I don't know. In the UK, for example, we're at 22, and France is at 17, and Sweden 19. So the European model is clearly one where it's, we're not investing, or we're not choosing to invest in our own learning. But maybe nobody is. I'm not sure. US is 30%. So although there's a perception maybe of that being the US model, based on those figures, they're sort of midpoint in where they are. So I don't know. I mean, maybe there is something about the shifting nature of I don't know, maybe portfolio careers, and the emerging generation, the next generation of workers may well change their approach to learning and take a lot more individualized responsibility for it than the current workforce, and certainly my generation would have done.
I don't know how old you are, Jez, but yes, I think people are, I mean, I'm 56. I think in my generation, people very much typically expected that you would go to school, you'd learn, go to university, and that was it. That's not my view, and I think it does differ amongst people. Certainly, I think a classic case of this is the collapse of the Soviet Union and the response of individuals to that in terms of employment and training. A lot of people were left high and dry by their mindset of shifting very rapidly from a command and control economy to a very free market economy, or perhaps an oligarchy economy, but one certainly which was largely capitalist. And a lot of people found it very difficult to shift. Not everybody, and so some people made the mindset shift. A lot of talk about mindset shift during the conversation. Gail asked the question, what do people see as learning? This is kind of tricky. We're talking about who should make opportunities to learn available, how much should companies put into it, and so on. But Gail said, look, in some cultures, watching YouTube videos learning, whereas elsewhere it's got to be a 2-day course out of the office. So do we have anything on that from the research, the different views and how that's reflected, or did you define it in some way?
I don't think we have. I don't think I mean, the closest we've probably got within it is the changing nature of social, the changing nature of the different types of learning approaches versus what I would probably call more curriculum-based learning.
Mm-hmm.
So stuff which is much more informally driven and much more driven by individual need at individual time. I don't think necessarily that the findings were massively conclusive around that. On a personal, maybe more anecdotal level, and some of the work that I've been doing in certainly this year has been much more working with organisations that are starting to think about what it means to do learning in a digitally enabled world with a digitally enabled workforce, and the shifting nature of knowledge and how people are acquiring knowledge and their expectations around learning as a result. And, you know, the flexibility, the agility, the ability to access different sorts of knowledge in different ways at different times, you know, clearly driven by, you know, the shifting nature of technology from, you know, driven by smartphones, etc. And the rise of YouTube and the rise of Netflix in terms of our ability to be able to filter what we want and how we want it, and it be filtered back to us as well. That will, without question in my mind, start to impact on the strategy and approach that learning and development will need to take to reflect an emerging generation and a shift. But in terms of the data,
sorry, go on.
Sure.
There's a couple of points I want to just bring up very quickly. I mean, Gail says that some employees will actually learn without knowing they're learning and won't even call it learning. Of course, that's absolutely true. And Dave P. raised this point, saying if you receive experience, that will lead to learning. Just one final point about what it means to learn again, but this time slightly differently across cultures. Do we know what the expectation baseline is about whether people should have time during the working hours to learn, which you did touch on? And Annalisa said also she thought there was a case of different expectations there in terms of whether people should be able to learn in outside work, or whether they should be looked after and able to learn in work, and that was the responsibility of the employer.
Yeah, I think there's a question there about on the job and off the job, and what the shifting the shifting focus of that is. Again, I just think it's a reflection of the emerging changing of how we see learning. Really,
it's tough, isn't it? Because what happens is you produce this research, and we all want to know more about stuff you didn't ask, and it's impossible to answer the question.
Exactly, and I think some of it is the context, you know. And I think that when you're doing a global piece like this, the context is so different that you know, there are certain aspects of this which I'd love to do more work into.
And look, Christine virtually volunteered herself as a research assistant on this as well. I think there is definitely stuff here. I think we're all fascinated, particularly on the global point of expectations, how people see learning. I think it would be an absolutely fascinating piece of research. A lot of companies would find it incredibly useful because it would wake them up to some of the issues. I'm thinking particularly about US companies that say, yeah, we're going to roll out this program without really being aware, not just cultural differences generally, but specifically of cultural differences and thoughts about learning. Look, we could talk about this all day long, and I think the people on this call would love to do that, but we've all got day jobs and we have to pay the rent. On the slide, okay, one quick one from James. He says, on the slide, top tech and approaches in the next 3 to 5 years, there was no classroom training column here, and I think that is a good point, actually. I did notice that, James. Was there any thought about the classroom training, the amount of classroom training increasing, decreasing, staying static? Any research on that for our audience?
I would have to go back and look at what the questions that were asked by the researchers, if I'm truthful. As I'm talking, I've just pulled it up now just to see if there's anything that jumps out straight away. I don't recall there being a specific question about classroom, but what I can do, Donald, is I'll have a look in, and if there is, I shall send it through to you, and you can post it. Or
that'd be brilliant. Send it through to me. I'll post it on Twitter and LinkedIn, and stick it onto the archive as well, so we've got it there. That'd be great.
Yeah. Okay.
We are going to have to wrap up. I'm sorry. I know that we've all got day jobs. Dave P says, my kids at school and uni use classroom training. It works really well. Thank you, Dave P.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I'm always the one for saying there are reasons we use the classroom in certain occasions, particularly at school, and it works. Let's not knock it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Look, thank you very much, everybody. Let me quickly go to the outro, and thank you very much, Jez. A lot of stuff there. It's great when you get stuff that makes you think in the morning. I love it. Thank you very much, Jez from Kineo, for taking us through this. Jez Anderson. If you've got little nuggets from that you want to share with the world, please do so on Twitter and use LSG Webinar as your hashtag if you can. Rory's got some more stats there in the chat. Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Rory, you dropping that in. And yeah, as I said, everything's available from Monday at the latest. It might be sooner. The recording, the slides, and the web chat. And next up, we've got at 12 o'clock we've got Ilse Lansel Sandvoort from Halt Ashridge taking us through. It's a really interesting view about how learning technology is changing things. It's actually, I'm not sure the title quite conveys it, but it's a really snappy presentation with a lot of interesting insight into learning technology at work. Guys, thank you very much for your contributions. As Christine Locker says, in capitals, it was fabulous. Thank you very much. And once again, our thanks to Jez Anderson and, of course, John Yates, who introduced from Kineo, taking us through the third survey from Kineo about the global learning race. Jez, thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Have a good day, everybody. Thank you.